you can anticipate the occupant needs as you plan for new projects. And a lot of that's is related to using evidence and data that we collect from our projects to inform that process. That's what these learning objectives are really geared to accomplish. So before we get started, let me ask Danny to launch our first poll, just to get in a sense of who's on board with us today. This will help me shape some of what the conversation is, so I can fine tune it a little bit. We can't do a lot of interaction, but we want to achieve the highest degree that we can. So these polls are one way we thought we would structure that in for you. So. Give another little second as you're putting your answer in.
All right, looks like we have 72%, so.
Okay, we've got a lot of architects in the room. Just barely a majority, right? We should vote for something. We should vote on something right now. We would love it. My first career was as an architect. So before I got more involved in architectural engineering, that's I hail from there. But I see we do have some engineers in the room also, and some building owners. So that's good to see. We have a good representation, and this is a little bit of a trick question. I threw an occupant at the bottom. I want to encourage us to think. I want to invite you to remember that you're an occupant, and to go ahead and pull from that experience into the professional practice. There's a lot of norms with how we interact, but really our own experience in our homes, and the way we interact with buildings at a very personal level, there's no reason that shouldn't have just as much purchase on the talents and skills that we bring to the profession as we seek to create habitat. So thank you for participating in that first poll. There's a few more on the way. Just not completely related to the topic, but I would feel remiss if I didn't provide a little bit of a nod to this weird context we're in right now with health in the built environment. We've always recognized that buildings have an impact on our global systems. That's what AIA 2030 is all about. It's about appreciating and impacting, trying to move that impact. Increasingly, we're recognizing that the health impacts are also associated with the way we create our environments. And so this isn't just about building design, this is about planning, the way buildings interact and the way our communities are set up to work together. This is a few days old, but COVID's frank reminder of how much of a community we are, a global community. And it, in that sense, reveals some things that might be lost to us day to day. Even with our global trade environment, sometimes we lose the sense that we are so interconnected. We are, as a species, really forming a new habitat on this earth. And I don't think it's all terrible. That's not what this presentation is about. I think there's an enormous opportunity in this as well. Hopefully our night skies don't look like this in 50 years, and we become more intelligent about the importance of day and light shifts and the quality of the air and water and things that anthropogenic activity is influencing as we think about the other species that share our habitats with us. We also are, softening our hearts towards each other, I think, and recognizing the equity that's built in our environments and how they can create stress, frankly. So 1 in 5 of us, you see these percentages are pretty high of individuals that could achieve a diagnosis for having a mental illness. That could be things like anxiety. I think 1 in 20 of us suffer from anxiety. Another 1 in 20 of us suffer from depression. Those are big numbers. And then there's increasing numbers of other, especially cognitive impairments and sensory involvements, things like autism to be cognizant of. I don't think these are unrelated to this image of how we're shaping our built environment. And so, again, we're talking really big picture here, but I'm bringing it down in focus to really deliver on the promise of those learning objectives you saw. That the health of our bodies is the health of our ecosystems. I'm looking forward to this book by Sarah Jensen Carr that will be released in the fall, tracing the history of 6 epidemics throughout our society, and what the physical response of those, topography is kind of that word referencing what does it look like physically in our society. There's a lot of standards that we're seeing related to that gap between what prescriptive requirements are, what we've agreed to as society is an acceptable building, what the code minimum is, and what some of the market desires. And so these are prying things like Fitwell and the Well Building Standard, the Living Building Challenge. They're sort of a little levers acting in that space. Of course, LEED has been there the longest. I think those are important signs to us about ways that our environments can better match our dispositions in terms of our needs. All of our, not just from physiological, like for air quality, water quality, good lighting, but also the mental health, insulation from stress and access to nature being 2 key of those indicators that many of these, in fact, I'd say all of these, except, resets really focus on air, but all of these standards do address that mental health component. The other dimension, though, is that not only is it about our bodies and our habitat, but something that's between us, our societies. And this is something my colleague Marcel, who's presenting one of these webinars in a couple weeks, is also will be. He's opened my eyes to this, and so I'm thankful to have that his anthropological appreciation of how much we are changing, not in our genome, but in the ways we interact with each other. And again, this is sort of linking back to that realization that COVID-19 is putting it right in front of us, how interconnected we are and the impact of the choices we make communally. So behaviorally, we're actually pretty new, right? And in terms of creating indoor environments, our species is brand new. I mean, it's only 4 generations back where we started thinking about cooling buildings to occupy them, and our heating became much more sophisticated. Lighting happened about 100 years ago at a mass scale in indoor environments. So we're still learning about how to create indoor, I call it indoor climate, but it's brand new tech in terms of us as the species. And I think we have a lot of ways to go. This is a great guide for that, Eleanor Ostrom's 8 principles of what organizations look like that are able to achieve. And again, this is a presentation about planning, so this is how you set up a team to deliver a good project. And this is the last slide at this sort of big scale to preface the conversation. But I just wanted to put this out there. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. We really need to do a whole presentation just on this. And there's cool things happening, like just the kind of ESG label for corporations that's growing in prominence, that's launched by the Living Building Challenge. We have a just label at BranchPattern. You can check that out if you're curious about what that's principle 4 there related to transparency, ways to enforce pro-social behavior within a cooperative environment of an organization. So with that, thanks for letting me trespass a little bit on this situation that we're in, all sort of being at home. Let's get into more of the technical content that we wanted to share here about the planning process and launch our second poll. The majority of influence is actually socioeconomic, so about 40% of an occupant's health is predicted by their socioeconomic status. So that's things like their income and the neighborhood they live in. sorry, it wouldn't be the neighborhood they live in. That would be the physical environment, and that's associated with around 10%. So I wanted to share that kind of insight into what really drives health in terms of it being primarily an aspect of our kind of the socioeconomic system. I think about 20% is related to health access and the quality of the healthcare. So that's a big one. But the environment really is not a driver. It does have an impact though, right? It's not unimportant. It's just confounded with many more social variables. So I just share that at the outset because I want us to keep in mind that the building isn't the most important thing when it comes to someone's health. And we really need to rely on experts in the public health world for insights and to bring them into our teams even to allow us to achieve higher levels of performance, because we can't promise occupant health with the building, right? It takes much more. That's why programs like the Well Building Standard that are geared towards occupant productivity and health really do address the policies that are associated with how you operate a building. But with that said, the rest of this presentation is focused on those things that, because they're very persistent effects, right? If we create a good built environment, 100% of the occupants get the benefit of that effect, right? It's not like a wellness program that may be launched by a company, which, only a portion of the employees may participate in. And it's the thing that, as professionals, that we can influence also. So that's what this presentation is really about. It's just wanted to put it in the right perspective, that it's not the be and end all, just being honest to the science and the evidence that we know about the health of an individual and their abilities to perform their job well. So we've actually aggregated a lot of that knowledge into a wellness calculator that forms the basis of many of the much of the information you're seeing here. We'd love to share that tool with you. For example, in investigating how underfloor air distribution would impact an organization that was looking at investing, trying to decide if they wanted a traditional air distribution system or a raised floor where the supply air comes through vents that are actually installed in the raised floor tile. We identified that the energy savings wasn't that significant and wouldn't be a decision factor for them. But when they noticed the reduced infectious rate, it did trip their choice to actually proceed with this. So just a little snippet of how pulling in some evidence about research studies that have been done in the field can be generalized to inform decisions that clients make. We also have been learning a lot about the influence of light on our performance and our health in terms of our ability to get good sleep, and just the acute effects also, like what's happening right at the moment. That's another thing to consider when you're planning a facility. It's what are the times that people will be in there. One more way that our changing body of evidence is starting to inform things like different color temperatures for different types of buildings in different spaces, or even the same space at different times of day using dynamic color. Similarly, we actually don't have nearly enough evidence about the influence of the sensory environment on individuals with autism. This is an area of my interest, but we are learning more about it all the time. And there's a lot of guidelines that can help us just from the research that is available and the community that we do have to lean on related to inclusive design. We can do much better right now by informing our designs at the front end with the evidence available. We actually have shared a little, this is an article you can get, but also there's a snippet about some key principles, just a list of things in each category for lighting, for air quality, for views that can help create a sensory friendly environment. Even things like Germicidal Lighting, which is a new technology. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, but it's changed the lights to more of a blue color. It goes into kind of ultraviolet mode. And the idea is probably when people aren't in a room, it's just the ambient lights would light the whole room up, and and all the surfaces that the light can touch, that the light can reach or irradiate, it has a germicidal effect. So that's getting deployed now increasingly, and it's gaining market share. So we were curious about it and started wondering, are there other things that that's going to do before we start hitting the yes button on strategies like that. So just some example of how some general research that's changing all the time in the world can inform the discussions at the front end of a project. So with the time left, I want to get into some case studies, but let's do another poll before we do that. Okay, so this is another one where there's not exactly a right answer. You're probably getting starting to see how I've written these polls, but what would you say are the three most important factors that'll determine if an occupant is satisfied in the space, so is of these options. So you should be able to check the three that you think are most relevant. Okay, results. Thermal comfort, yes, I think so. You guys are on the money. Hot and cold complaints are for a facility manager the most common thing that we hear. So the point I wanted to make really around this question is that there isn't agreement on this answer in the scientific literature. The evidence doesn't tell us the answer to this. And I just think this is a critical thing for us to understand. There's no silver bullet of combinations. There's no right temperature you can make a room that will satisfy everyone, just like there's no acceptable air quality for everybody. It's just because of the differences between us that makes that untenable. And again, that last one is actually the controllability. That's what I'd like to highlight here. And I think some of that will come through in these case studies that we're sharing, that the ability to adjust any of these factors, any of the dimensions of the physical environment, is probably what's most associated with occupant agency and ultimately occupant satisfaction. So, as in the engineering world, we've long lived in the paradigm where we want to get the right temperature set points and control it to a certain band, or whatever the case may be, the right illuminance level, and have it evenly spread throughout a room. Well, we know from evidence that meeting the middle, hitting the center of the bell curve isn't good design. That means that, maybe the least number of people will be dissatisfied, but we can do better, right? We don't have to accept the compromise, especially with the technological advancements that we have today, and sort of designing for the prototypical occupant, which also, introduces so much bias, as a lot of the recent research has shown. The ASHRAE standards are really biased towards men, who are older, just because of the research cohort that's often involved in producing those guidelines. So thank you, Danny, for that poll. I want to go through three different types of studies that we've done, looking at different types of outcomes. So early childhood education, I want to look at the teacher satisfaction with the classroom. Very important factor. The teacher satisfied, the quality of teaching is better, or the child-student interaction is where we're operating. Try and get the classroom not to be irritant. Essentially, try and make it something that can support that interaction between teacher and student. So, how do you measure that, and how do we see which things make that better in the building? Same thing with higher ed. I'm going to show you an example of a project where we looked at student success in the classroom as the outcome, and we tried to associate it with which things actually in that building led to that. Finally, look at a corporate environment where we're measuring, how are people showing up at work? what's their activity, and we do an activity analysis to look at that behavior and tie that back to, well, what things are in the physical environment appear to be associated with that. In all these cases, we're targeting that behavior, and in all these cases, you see these are existing buildings. This is a presentation about planning, though. So again, the theme I'm trying to draw out is that the sorry, I was distracted by the chat for a second. The theme I'm trying to draw together here is that we actually have to rely on buildings that are in operation to inform future investments. In general, that's how research and evidence just work. So with that, let me jump into this evaluation of some early learning centers. We wanted to see how the teacher satisfaction was associated with indoor environmental quality. This relies on survey tools, which are great for benchmarking. I think we often think that surveys are kind of just mushy data that's not that useful. And a lot of times that's how they're conducted, if I'm honest too. Our industry, the construction industry, is in real estate, I guess, lump in there, is not great at conducting good psychometrics on their assessments. So we can bring much more science to assessing these survey results just by asking things like, how satisfied are you with your job? If we ask that in the same survey that we're asking, how satisfied are you with the temperature, then we can get rid of a lot of the noise, because we know that job satisfaction, or how satisfied are you with your direct report, is actually highly correlated with how satisfied you are with your physical environment. We don't have to throw up our hands and say that the survey's not giving us good information. We can actually just improve the surveys to try and identify, actually, when you have a group of people giving you feedback, it's actually very rich and it's very affordable to get this type of data too. You can spend a lot of time walking around a building with a lot of sensors and not learn as much about how your actual physical environment is performing in a building as you can with a survey. That's my pitch for taking this a little more seriously, occupant surveys, and especially if you repeat it in a space, that we call that a repeated measure, that becomes very statistically significant. So you can really see trends. Just like we monitor energy use, you need a baseline, and then if you see changes, you know something's happening. Same thing with occupant satisfaction. Just ask the same question each time. Ask it the same way. We looked at 2 schools. They were built about 10 years apart. So that created a nice set of differences in the classrooms. We measured each of these classrooms. There were, I believe, 16 in each of the centers. This is kind of what they look like. So high quality early childhood care model, really. This client obviously was willing to support the research also. Another indicator that we had a great opportunity for success. We took really these are the 2 things. On the left, you see just a little clip from the type of survey that we generated for the teachers. And then we wanted to compare that to things we could actually measure. So these are the baskets that we dropped in the ceilings. You can see them, how we actually deployed them at night while the kids weren't there. They got this little spaceship in their room for a couple of days while we collected at least 24 hours of data. And then we wanted to see how the room by room data compared, because the teachers were each in a room too. So we could associate the teacher's response to the room they were in to see if what we measured in that room was connected to how satisfied they were, just to get some of the subtle differences. Because, surprisingly, there are it's amazing how different one room can be from the next in the same building, especially things like acoustics. It's, it looks the same on the inside, but because of the way the duct is routed, you might have 10 decibels more background noise in one classroom than the classroom right next door to it. And that makes a very natural experiment. We can see that variation in the physical environment and correlate it with teacher satisfaction. So this is visual overload, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what you're seeing overlaid here is what we measured. And it's over 24 hours. This is at night. That's why that's why you're seeing the cycling. That's actually the air handler kicking on and off overnight is the black line, and the lights are off. That's the orange line. And you can see the humidity, that sort of pink line, it sort of drifts down as the system is on setback, as well as the temperature. This was in the winter time. So this was when the kids were in the room, and you can kind of see when the CO2, which is the green line, spikes. Early activity, 10:30, kids are active. Probably a little bit of gross motor happening even within the room, and then drops down around 11, probably lunchtime. Kids probably, or they might have gone outside. Actually, yeah, they ate lunch in the classroom, I'm sorry. So that's when they would have been outside when the green line drops there. The CO2 levels respond pretty quickly. So that just gives you a feeling for the type of data we were able to collect in those classrooms. The surveys from the teachers, we got pretty rich data here as well. We had multiple teachers in each classroom, which improved the statistical power of our tests, because we could sort of triangulate that way. And these are some of the results that we saw. A lot of them are what you'd expect. Honestly, this kind of wasn't rocket science. It's just a lot of validation. But on the left was how satisfied the teacher is with the views in the classroom. That was kind of the set of questions we collapsed into that index. And that was associated with the Illuminance Ratio, which was the lightest place with just electric light, the darkest place in contrast to the brightest place. So a lot of times we go for uniformity when it comes to illuminance. What we found is that when there's greater contrast, when there's less uniformity in illuminance, there's more dark spots and more bright spots. The teachers actually gave their classrooms higher scores. I'm showing you the actual scatter plot of results so you can get a feeling for the degree of significance. This was a statistically significant difference. So there's a 95% chance this was a real effect. That's kind of what the regression line shows. That's shown across those box plots. Similarly, we looked at the acoustics. So at night, when we were in the room measuring just the mechanical noise, we found that was associated with how teachers rated the acoustic quality of their classroom, which included noise as well as acoustic privacy. So that's not a surprise also. Other evidence supports that relationship. One thing that was a little interesting is we found that the satisfaction with temperature was better in rooms that face south. Especially, that wasn't as dominant in the infant rooms, which are basically crib. They're kind of set up with cribs. The kids aren't doing a lot of gross motor at that age. But for all the toddlers and pre-K, that relationship held true. So that was something we didn't expect to discover. That, but it's not a big surprise that having some direct sun in the classroom might be associated with higher thermal comfort scores, especially if teachers are often cold. Finally, CO2 was associated, more CO2 led to lower satisfaction with air quality. So in general, a couple kind of cool high-level findings. We just asked overall, like blue sky, how satisfied are you with the classroom? We found that the most correlation was to their job satisfaction. So they tended to answer that question like they answered the question, how satisfied are you with your job? We also found that if they had more plants in the room, they answered that they had a higher response for their satisfaction. So that's not causation. It doesn't mean we could go put plants in the room and create higher IEQ scores from the teachers, but there's something suggested there, right? That's what we're always looking for, trying to explore those links between biophilia and those responses. It might be that the teachers were more satisfied because they had greater agency, and that's why they brought the plants in, right? It's hard to know which causes which. And it also bore out one of the things we've known for a long time, that people like more area. If you give people less area, whether they're an office worker or a teacher or a student, the satisfaction goes down. That's something that holds across all three of these case studies. I've been talking a lot. I'm sensing just myself. So I'm going to kind of speed through this one, and then we'll get to another poll and wrap. Danny, do you want to interject? Have we had any chats that we should take a pause for? Or?
Actually, no Q&A has come through yet, so I would encourage everyone that if you do have questions to get them into the Q&A box there, either with your name or you can do that anonymously so that we can have a lively Q&A session here at the end.
Yeah, let's try a raise hand. Just give me a hand raise if you're okay with the pace that this content's coming at. And so don't raise your hand. So don't click raise hand if you'd like it to either go. I'm assuming I might be going too fast is what I'm kind of wondering. So if you think I'm going too fast, don't raise your hand. If you're okay with this pace, give me a hand raise. Okay, I'm seeing the majority of people actually saying they're okay. So I'll try and split the difference a little bit as we move forward. This higher ed example was a building that's getting used for a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of different departments within the same building. So it's a complicated one, perfect for a little bit of investigation. What we decided to do is take the data that we could find for the facility and how it's working and combine it with data that we would collect from the rooms. And just like kind of that last example I walked through, create a structure. This time we were working more integrally with the departments. So we were actually helping to link the facilities department with the Office of Student Success within the institution. So that was our goal, was not just to do this as a research project, but actually help our client develop some of this capability of combining data sources to get new insights about facility performance. So we're not going to look at these slides. I just wanted you to get a sense for what I'm talking about. Registrar data is like, well, what classes are being taught in which rooms and how many people are enrolled in those classes. So that gives us basic utilization information for the building. We also had access to student, they anonymized student data and shared it with us so that we could see how well students did in the classes that were taught in the building. So that was another source of data that we could load into a model where we evaluated how well is this building performing. And then we collected data, we did observations, we call it ethnographic observations, just basically it's a structured way of seeing how the space is being used and creating an index about it. We also created a survey similar to the last one, a little briefer than that teacher survey. We needed it to be completed in just under 5 minutes, so we only had a few questions we could ask. We collected measurements in each of the rooms while the students were actually in class, and that gave us some insight into how they were being used. This was kind of part of our ethnography, collecting some of these measurements about what was CO2 drifting up to during a class period, what was the background noise like as the teacher was presenting even. And then we started combining this and seeing what was by room. So each of these rows was a room. So room 100 in this building, we were able to see the number of students that were in that building, were in that room, and we averaged 6 semesters. So over 6 semesters, 1,123 students saw that room. Were enrolled in a class in that room. And we had their average GPA that they were awarded for that class that they took in the room. We knew how many courses were taught in that room, which then gives you the average number of students per course. And so you can get really rich data that's just conveniently available. I mean, the university already, has this convenience. Sometimes the facilities department, I don't think has easy access to some of this information. And then we actually loaded in our information. That's what's on the right-hand side here that we collected about the room, like what's its lighting level, what is the background noise in that room, like when the mechanical system is on but nobody's in there, what's the unoccupied CO2 level, what are the temperatures like, and so on. And that gave us insight into the utilization. So this is probably a little too much detail to go into just as I'm looking at the time, but we bend the classes by the number of students in each class to say, we're trying to understand, are you really utilizing these classes? Because a lot of the classrooms were sized, as you can see, between 16 and 35 students was the capacity of the room could hold, but most of the classes were on the low end of that. That's what the blue and green line shows, that actual enrollment was much lower. So in some ways, they had too many empty chairs in each class. It's kind of what this chart shows. The survey indexed those 9 questions we mentioned. We were able to get this level of data for each of those items. We found differences between students and staff in a few areas, like the furniture. Students were quite a bit less satisfied than the staff. You know, that could be related to age or the fact that they have different furniture. Lighting also. Students were a little more satisfied than staff. Again, we know as people who are older, your eyes don't see as well. So it helps to have more light. That's one of those adjustments that we can make instead of choosing on the bell curve. We estimated what it would be like if we modified those indoor conditions. Like, what would the gains you could be that you could anticipate? And this is kind of what we saw. This was our basic data. When we actually crunched the numbers, our predictions matched up pretty much with what we saw. So again, I'm showing you the actual box plot and the regression, so you don't think I'm overstating the data. Again, these results I'm showing you are 95% confidence that there's an effect here, but for every 7 decibels we reduce background noise, we can expect the grade point to go up by 0.1 of students in that class. Again, that's the correlation. That I sort of stated that as, if you reduce it, that will happen, but that's what we saw in the field. Again, more lighting, so brighter rooms, was correlated with better grades also. That's evidence that we already know. So reinforcing findings that we've seen before. Finally, this is what I mentioned, that if you increase the number of area per chair, or like per occupant in the room, you'll see that room get used more, right? Because these, in some ways, you can think of them as being kind of a market of rooms, because the teachers want to schedule the rooms, right? The rooms that they like. So the rooms that they like are preferred in part by how dense they are, and the less dense rooms are more preferred, is basically what this is showing. So what we discovered is that they actually cared less about GPA and more about just the student not dropping the class. That's the university's real determinant of student success. It's not, we came into it thinking that they'd want to optimize student grades, thinking that was associated with the learning. And they want students to graduate. They want them to graduate on time, get through the program. That's their definition of success. That's how they measure organizational achievement. So we started looking at the data that way and saw, well, 14% of the students dropped their class. How can we impact that number? What's driving that difference? And we evaluated each of the rooms and gave them a weight, just using a statistical regression to figure out which rooms were high performers. So students that were in room 217 over on the very left were much more likely to have students drop the class than students over on the classrooms on the right. So this is kind of like giving us a value of those rooms in terms of student completion. That fed into a clear recommendation about which rooms it would make sense to focus on for the university, based on a combination of wanting to bring up the lowest that obviously need to be addressed, but also where can they optimize the put through, and making the best rooms a little bit better also. So with that, we'll sort of go into this last part of the presentation with another poll. Fourth and final poll. What's most persuasive to building owners? As they're making decisions about what to invest in, what do you think would hold the most sort of convincing power or persuasive power? you can anticipate this is actually more about what you think than there being there's not a right answer here. I kind of want everybody to be able to see what this poll is to it, because I'm curious in the answer also. We have a lot of professionals on the call that have a lot of experience, so just answer in that spirit. All right, first cost, yeah, that stands out. And then personal experience and life cycle cost projections are a close second. So 2 economic ones there. Scientific evidence got 1 vote. Thank you, somebody. But I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly that the evidence does not tend to sway. That was a hard lesson for me, because I like using evidence, as you can tell, but it doesn't convince people. Oftentimes, I've noticed that when they actually visit a space and see how it works, that can be a difference. That can make a difference in their decision to choose to invest. And yeah, frankly, the budgets do drive a lot of discussions. That's the true experience. So thanks, Danny. Any other comments at this point before we go through the last slides here? Okay, we'll have more Q&A here. This won't take long. The last case study, we didn't do as much data crunching. So if you're feeling a little overloaded with charts, this will be a little lighter. This was looking at a corporate environment, and this sort of fuzzy picture here shows a little bit of what the company was doing. Just the employees have lockers where they put their stuff. Raise your hand. Have you guys worked on any of these unassigned desk spaces? I'm just curious. Has anybody worked or delivered a project that had flex work, or just open work seats where at the end of the day you leave the desk empty, you put your stuff in a locker, or kind of hot desking is another name? Raise of hands. I actually can't.
Looks like we have about 8.
Okay, so a few people have worked on these. Yeah, it's gaining popularity, I think, as owners want to continue to optimize their resources, and they recognize, especially with teleworking, people working from home, that there is an opportunity, right, to create a little better environment for what they do. This is what the plate looked like, where we did the analysis, where there's a mixture of types of space. So they have some conference rooms, kind of in that purple color, and some pretty dense benching that you see kind of in the green, with the green color. This was actually a financial organization. They were making a lot of phone calls and stuff during the day, was some of the main activity. Oh yeah, this slide. Doing computer work was the biggest category, but there's a fair amount of talking to each other and talking on the phone. So that's kind of what the office environment looked like. The analysis that we ran, we did ethnographic analysis, where we just tracked using a structured checklist every hour. We walked through the space, and for a week, checked what people were doing on a couple floors in the building where they were experimenting with this free address pilot, basically. What we found is that utilization wasn't great. Tuesday was their best day, where on average they were hitting 60-70% utilization. That means 60 or 7% of the desks had somebody in them. Is what we mean by that. That's if they were in a conference room, we counted that as an occupant, and we didn't count the total number of people the floor could hold. We just counted the total workstations in this utilization. So if they were in a conference room, we counted them as if they were sitting at a workstation, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. And Friday, everybody wants to, Monday and Friday were good work from home days. So the organization had a policy where there was really no incentive to come to work. They made it equally fair and easy for employees to work from home. There was no stigma in the idea of working from home. So what they found as an organization was that they were a little actually frustrated, because they were hoping that more people would come to the office, even though they wanted to offer this policy for flexibility to employees. and they were looking for ways to motivate that. What we found is that the way they'd implemented this free address assignment really was an erosion of the privacy that the occupants felt. And it was also, they didn't get very much square footage. So the actual amenity of the workspace itself was a little denuded. It actually hurt some of those Ostrom's principles I was talking about earlier. It actually took a hit to their organizational culture because of the layout that they were experimenting with. So our recommendations for them were to recognize that the utilization is low. So if they want to keep the idea alive, so they could walk away from their work from home policy and say, okay, you guys come back to work. We don't want you to work from home. That'd be one way to address that. The other thing is that they could say, well, let's try and make it a little better. Let's give a little more privacy to employees, a little more square footage, maybe create some visual buffers within the space. So as I sort of pull this all together, in terms of the planning process for productivity, the way people behave in the space is really how we know that it's working well. And that if we give the occupants more control over their space, they tend to be more satisfied, which is highly associated with things like productivity, retention, and learning outcomes. So I think those are conversations that we can invite our clients into every time we start a process with them by a simple question of, what would you like us to look at in terms of previous experiences you've had, or your similar organizations, or even bringing some evidence to them to start that conversation. So I'm done. I hope you have been thinking of questions along the way. This is your time to ask them. And so I think, Danny, if you want to moderate or give a little instruction to how we can have some of this back and forth.
Sure. So we do have one question in. I would encourage everyone to send us your questions. The first one we have here is, I'd like to have some additional discussion on the impact of socioeconomic circumstances versus behavioral decisions. I suspect that behavior of the occupant is of greater impact than what the public health experts were indicating. Thoughts?
Yeah, so the way that's categorized, and I'm not a public health expert, but the individual behaviors are things like smoking, exercise, and diet. Those are big factors when it comes to your individual health. They're confounded, though, also with things like your income status, your educational attainment, and other socioeconomic indicators. So they try, when they're looking at the factors that impact that impact health outcomes, that's how they sort of separate out some of those confound, because those categories overlap, right? We all check multiple boxes. So your actual socioeconomic status was, if you pull apart the impact of your behaviors, and you pull out the impact of your access to healthcare and the quality of that healthcare, there's still 40% of the differences and the disparity in health is still described by that weird block that's called socioeconomic status. And the path analysis or the causal reason isn't clear. That's again, like a lot of the public health research, that's the correlation that's less. So that's my take on the data, although there's really good evidence from the CDC on this. That's where the statistics I've seen come from. When it comes to specifically the built environment, there's probably another layer there. That's looking at public health of entire populations, not just within a building, right? But the truth is, we don't spend our whole lives in a building. We spend our lives in multiple buildings. So that public health perspective really is a good place to start. And the Fitwell information, if you look at their rating system, they provide a great way of navigating that data into things you can actually do with a building. that's supported by good studies. That's my best template and answer. Thank you for the question.
I have a question for you, Stuart. So for those of the participants and attendees who are involved in facility planning, either from the owner side or the design side, what would be like maybe one or two of your biggest pieces of advice on the next facility planning phase from the research that you've gathered here?
Right, I think it's probably already on their mind. It's the ultimate goals of the organization. Like if you're working with a campus, a lot of times there's a focus on attracting more students, or potentially on attracting and retaining researchers. So there's no reason that the way you deploy your facilities can't help you with that. In fact, I think that's oftentimes what's underneath capital campaigns, is the recognition that, oh, if we build a new college of business, this is going to attract more MBA students, which will increase our revenue. You know, it has all those desired impacts. But we can pull if we recognize that's the goal at the outset. We can pull those strategies all the way early to early planning, even to programming. Identify, well, which types of spaces will actually be associated with students getting excited when they visit, right? It's not just the classroom spaces, and we intuitively know that, but a lot of times there's differences in the just generational differences between people who are running the project and the people you're trying to attract, whether they're researchers or students. And so that would be that's kind of higher ed example. You could take that and extrapolate it to a neighborhood school project, or any other, like a healthcare facility where you want to look at the health outcomes of patients, the number of times they come back to the hospital, reducing that. Those are all things that can encourage us to do simple things like putting signs up. It's amazing the power of a sign in the built environment. We don't, you know, especially if you come from kind of the architectural background, you don't really want to think a lot or talk a lot about those strategies that feel like wallpaper, right? But they have such a huge influence on the way the space is perceived. In one study with people in a hospital room, if you just told them the types of noises they were going to be hearing outside, their cortisol levels went down from acoustic distress, which is very important. You know, people's stress levels, their blood pressure, and cortisol from the swab in their mouth. If you can impact that just by communicating to them, hey, there's going to be nurses walking by with carts, just so you know, that made more of a difference than other strategies like better insulating their room from that noise in the first place. So just giving people information, that's one little example of something that we might not think to talk a lot about at the beginning of a project, but can make a huge difference for getting where you want to go.
Great. Okay, we do have a couple more rolling in. So this first one, based on your last study, what is your opinion on the future of open office design? And then I might add that some of the webinars I've been attending about the long-term effects of this pandemic is suggesting that we will actually need less square footage of office space now that we're seeing the possibilities of work from home. So I guess we can lump those both into the same question here.
Yeah, thanks. I think we will get better at this type of interaction. I hope we can, because while I've enjoyed the polls, I feel like we're still missing a little bit of the connection here that I would get if we were able to be together in person. But I think we'll continue to get better with these platforms. I think we'll also get better when we are together. Our expectations will be higher. We'll want conference rooms that work better with the technology, but just with the lighting, so we can see each other's face, so we're rendered in color. And I think there'll be a little less of our phones getting in the way of us when we're together person to person. And I think we will see that in the future of the workspace. Being able to personalize your space is an important factor. It gives you a sense of agency and ownership. I don't think that means you need to own it, though. And I don't know exactly how that looks, but so much is related to social norms and creating a culture where it's okay to be you and to bring yourself into the space. So again, some of those recommendations we made on that project that I shared were make this amenity, this workplace amenity, a little bit better. Give a little more privacy, give a little more square footage, make the conference rooms easier to access if you want to take a private call, so that there's enough, so that you don't have to go, take the call in the hallway or outside or something. Those are the types of changes I think we can expect to see, and I think we will continue to see more open office environments. It just feels like what the next generation is excited about too. The day of having your private office, all except for some market sectors, I'm sure that will continue to be the default. But I think for most of office space, we're going to continue to see a growth in open office environments and probably more shared space too.
Great, thanks. Okay,
Yeah.
we have 10 more minutes. I think I can combine these questions here too. So the infancy of a project is the best point to begin gathering data and introducing these concepts. How have you been able to successfully engage the owner ahead of when a design team would typically be engaged, which would likely be too late to fully influence the outcome? And then I think lumping that to this next question about budget, so knowing that the budget is a deciding factor in an owner's decision to move forward with these best practices, how do you get the design team to buy into the philosophy and meet the goal of achieving these ideas? So coming in early on a project, but then also the budget constraints.
Right, thank you. Good questions. I think I want to actually just sneak back for a second to this slide I shared, because this wasn't really part of the presentation per se, but is apropos to this. If we can recognize that we're in a relation already, that we don't have to wait for a project to start, I think that's our step forward. And maybe this presentation is part of that. I hope that it has been for you. I hope that this has been a realization that you can start now thinking about your next project, and some of these thoughts about how to bring evidence and human-centered design, a focus on occupant outcomes to inform that process. But inevitably, it's going to look like reaching outside of our normal working groups to involve a broader group. And that means more inclusive and transparent approach, and a little less ownership probably of the ultimate, right? If we have more shared ownership, that means there's no one, the designer isn't going to get the same credit, right, at the end of the process. If it's been a truly collaborative journey to get to the outcome. So I think there's this, not that there won't continue to be iconic, powerful buildings, right? I think there'll always be those amazing buildings that are art and also building together. But for the majority of our square footage, I'm talking about creating an opportunity to have more meaningful relationships where we put the relationship before the project even. So that's, I think that can be created within a project team between an owner and a builder and a design team and the occupants and even the community. I would reach it out that far. And in fact, that relationship already exists. The owner has worked with the design team before on some project, most likely. They've worked with the builder before, or the builder's worked in the community and the institution, or we already have these relationships. The conversation can start right now. That would be my sort of response to the first one. I kind of forgot the second question, Danny, I'm sorry.
Overcoming budget issues and budget constraints.
Oh, right. Yeah. Again, I think if we frame the discussion, we'll understand that the investments are not about a loss in revenue to run a building and a sort of burden on the organization, but yet it's part of its revenue center. And so we'll see it as a return on investment opportunity. Sometimes we're seeing, like in some of our corporate experiences with clients, we're recognizing that their facilities department is coming under the HR as part of the benefits package. I think that's a trend we'll continue to see in the workplace, where the office environment is treated as a perk, right? And so it wants to be high quality, It wants to be novel and engaging. It wants to be more fun than home, right? So that creativity occurs there, is invited there, and it's a backdrop for that. And so if that becomes the goal, then the whole investment concept, and in fact, some of the people making the decisions on whether it's a good investment or not, might not be the people that have made those decisions traditionally, for what the scale of the budget is. I think that's a change we're seeing a little bit in the marketplace culturally. Obviously, for school districts and stuff, they're a little more insulated from that process than the corporate sector. But I do think we're seeing that culturally, just as expectations of occupant rights and occupant access to control continue to increase. We expect more from our buildings all the time. As I shared on this slide, we've only been doing this, at this intensive level where we spend so much time we spend 90% of our time inside now. We haven't been doing that very long, right? That's still pretty new. And it's going to continue to the way that looks is going to continue to change. We're going to continue to expect more. We're going to expect our indoor environments to be more like outdoors to make up for that fact.
Great, thanks. There are a couple more questions. I'm not sure we'll get to everything, but we will make sure to reach out with some comments here post-webinar. If you maybe, Stuart, just in a couple minutes could answer, the last two we have open here are about the preservation of historical buildings versus new buildings, regardless of building type, and how that impacts productivity. And then the last question is about, I think the comment came from the importance of acoustic performance with occupants, and if we should try to push to specify more carpet, so that's maybe where the acoustical issues are coming from. So.
Yeah, I'll take the carpet first. That's pretty straightforward. There's sometimes concerns with air quality in carpet. If you have a more institutional client, that might come up, or if you're doing like an exam room, carpet's probably off the table. But it does have some acoustic benefit. It's not enormous. It's not nearly as good as adding some like acoustic wall panel, 2-inch fiberglass or something. But people do respond positively. That was some of the survey results I didn't share from that study of the early learning environments. The teachers, there were some rooms that had resilient flooring and other rooms that had carpet. And the teachers that had carpet were just more satisfied with their room. So it's not just about acoustics. At least that's my judgment, because the reverberation times in those rooms were not that different. The acoustic ceiling, the absorption of that eclipses the difference it makes, at least in a room that size, a room under 1,000 square feet. The ceiling is much more impactful of the acoustic environment to the response time for the room than just whether it's resilient or carpet. So that's kind of a quick summary of that. I think there's an aesthetic component that makes it feel like you're more, maybe it might actually be more domestic environment, or feel a little more at home with carpet.
We are hearing from Brad Lewis, our acoustic practice lead here too, that carpet does help footfall noise, not absorption. So that mechanical noise issue that you mentioned. Yeah. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah. If you have a multi-tenant building with people above, residential units especially, or even a building with concrete deck, the carpet will still make a big difference in the impact noise from space to space. That's a good point. In terms of historic buildings, I mean, there's a very small percentage, I forget the actual statistic, of square footage that's built new each year. If you look at the total gross square footage that we have in our country, right? So I know it's kind of obvious, but yet as an industry, we are pretty focused. We kind of fixate even on only that square footage that's getting new. We pay attention to RFPs that come out. We spend a lot of our time. We even have different, the institution has its own capital projects department that's often separate from the facilities management and maintenance department. That's how much we focus on the new square footage versus just keeping everything going. And I think that will continue, we'll get better at that. I think that's a missed opportunity. We wait until things really have failed. You know, the trigger becomes just totally dilapidated interiors or unmaintainable mechanical systems or lighting that just looks, you know, they're T12s and you just can't live with it anymore. I mean, we wait until it becomes very painful to invest in our buildings. And this is culturally, I'm not indicting anymore. This is how our society works here in the States. So I think that speaks to the historic quality of buildings and our investing in them over time, choosing to keep them instead of to demolish them, which is often our choice. And sometimes we make buildings as if they could be demolished, right? Which ultimately, I guess every building comes down, right? If you look super far out, but I think we can be more honest about talking about the lifespan, that we want the structure of the building to last 300 years. We should be explicit. We shouldn't be afraid to say that we want, you know, in 8 more generations, somebody to still be able to use the structure. We know that it's going to be reclad. We know the windows will change. We know the roof will be different, and a lot of the interiors will change. But thinking about how we achieve that is really more about the people who own the buildings and creating the ways of addressing the occupant need. That's kind of all I can think of in terms of framing that right now. But
well, thank you. And Stuart, if you don't mind going to the last slide, we do have 4 more webinars this month. I'm also going to launch one last poll here. So if you would like to continue this conversation and a follow-up discussion, just indicate yes here, and we will follow up with you with a second meeting in the next couple weeks. So the 4 webinars coming up here are this Friday, using data to make design decisions, and then the following 3 Wednesdays. So April 8th is Net Zero Hospitals. April 15th is the human side of successful lighting and daylighting. And then our last webinar here on Earth Day, the Energy Health Nexus. So that should be a lot about energy efficiency and IEQ together. So thank you everyone for participating. Please be sure to fill out the survey through your web browser, and this will also be emailed out to you at the conclusion of this webinar.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.